Hi, this is Jake, Politics by Jake. This is the edition for June 7th, 7 a.m. in the morning. And I am Jake, your political host and commentarist. And as usual, this is our weekly or semi-weekly briefing, sometimes weekly, sometimes semi-weekly, that we have on Mondays and Fridays. And it's an overview of events in the world and in the country. And it's got a historical and a political emphasis. Because one of the things that we talk about is that if you don't know history, history is at least as important to know as, say, for example, to use a juxtaposition, quantum physics, because your quantum physics will do you no good if your country is destroyed, because you don't recognize the elements of history, because things repeat themselves continually. Time after time, you see the same things coming up, the same attempts to oppress and repress humanity. And if you don't know what these were, you won't recognize them when they come again. So it's generally always possible for you to give the world a better direction. And I'm talking to you, my listeners. That is generally always possible. And we hope that this allows you to orient yourself in a tumultuous period. We've got all kinds of gaslighting operations. And that's basically telling a person things that are untrue so powerfully to the extent that they begin to doubt their own sanity. And you can do this wherever you are, not the gaslighting, but opposing the gaslight. There's always something you can do. I urge you, my fellow listeners, to figure that out and to start doing it, because we've got all sorts of brainwashing, as I say, all sorts of chaos, all sorts of confusion operations in the world. The Russian Federation, as led by Putin, who is nothing but a dictator, a de facto president for life, is ex-KGB, and once KGB, always KGB. And the KGB has been working with, it's a uniquely Russian word, disinformatsiya, which means disinformation. And you could call it propaganda, you could call it whatever you want. And my observations with regard to Putin is that, as is typical of all KGB or ex-KGB, they are relentless and they are always being provocative. They are always probing. They are searching for weakness, and you can't let up with them. Unfortunately, we wish that the Russian Federation would follow the rules-based organization of the international community, but they don't want to. They're mad. Or I should say Putin's mad, because finally, after basically it's over 20 years of appeasement, Putin was installed in January of 1999, and he immediately began, and he was actually doing some of this before, but he immediately began to attack countries. He's been attacking them all along. There's a bunch of what are called frozen conflicts, where the Russians have basically been stopped and they're still fighting, but they're getting nowhere. So they're kind of called frozen conflicts. And that's in the Caucasus, and the Transcaucasus. And he just doesn't stop. And because of the desire of the oligarchs to open the markets of Russia to them, to the Western markets, they have allowed and persuaded and inveigled politicians who could be bought, and there are plenty of them, politicians who could be bought in order to allow this, to appease this. We're deeply against appeasement, and with Joe Biden in the presidency, and I'll tell you, if Donald Trump had been in the presidency, this certainly wouldn't have happened. But with Joe Biden in the presidency, this has been stopped, and Putin is being stood up to. But it's chaos, and that's what's going on, and that's what we talk about here, because it's important for you to understand what's going on. I know that you don't have the time to research these things, but if you listen to my show, Politics by Jake, PB&J, the original peanut butter and jelly, you want to try to cut through the pervasive atmosphere of, again, this kind of brainwashing, this kind of gaslighting, these kinds of active measures. So, okay, we have a new fascist axis of evil. I don't know whether you've heard about this. I mean, I know, for example, that you guys know that Trump is now a convicted felon. We'll be calling him that on this show from now on. He's a convicted felon. I know you know that. I'm not going to be reporting much on that except to mention it incidentally. But this is a show that considers the threat to the United States from fascism, from MAGA, which actually could be arguably called a kind of fascism. If you go on Wikipedia and look at fascism, it's not just one thing. There's all different kinds. There's actually one category which is called clerical fascism. It's fascinating. When I looked at that years ago, it's instructive. You should go look at it. Go on Wikipedia and look up fascism. All different kinds, something like 30 different kinds or something like that. But there's a new fascist axis of evil. And this show, by the way, I didn't finish my thought, is against fascism, obviously. We are anti-fascist. We want to defeat fascism wherever we see it because it's a pernicious and hateful doctrine. Like I talk about, I borrow from other sources the phrase, every noxious, hateful bird, so on and so forth. I talk about Pandora's box and all the demons that leapt out. Fascism is one of them. So we're against that and we fight that. One of the things that Politics by Jake does. And we fight against MAGA because they are a kind of a fascist group and they are kind of a cult, actually. Some of them think that Trump is, and they actively believe this. I mean, they have T-shirts, they have banners and things like this, that Trump is God. They actually say this, or they believe that he is the son of God, or perhaps, and I see this less, but they think that he's God's messenger, or he's a prophet of God. So this is a cult, and we fight against that. So anyway, getting back to the point, we have a new fascist axis of evil, and that is mainland China, who I call the Chicoms. You'll hear me call the Chicoms, and that's short for the Chinese communists. And that's mainland China. That is not Taiwan, which is on the island of Formosa, not too far away from mainland China. And Russia is part of it, and Iran is part of it, and North Korea is part of it. And the whole idea of axis of evil, the Axis powers in World War II were Germany, they were Italy, and they were Japan. So those were three, and we're talking about four. We're talking about, once again, mainland China, the Chicoms, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. These are the four parts of the Axis. And it doesn't matter whether it's three or four, they make up an axis of evil in today's world. That's the adversary, or it's one of them. So that's who you've got to fight and weaken. And as you recall, I talked to you just a couple of moments ago about how in this show, it's important that you take action. And one of the things that we talk about is how you, the listener, can take action and how you can do it in your several circumstances one way or another. Because if we unite together, we will defeat this. And there's just no question that the people who are with us are greater than the people who are with them. And honestly, also, I might say, this axis, I think collectively, it's much weaker than is normally assumed. And this is Politics by Jake. And, with regard to this, I've talked about how there are moles in the media and that they're placed there, and there are domestic moles that are part of this this fascist combination that exists. There are commercial moles who are simply there to be gadflies, which is not so bad, but it's like weaponizing the media in order to promote the ideas of a pernicious doctrine and to stir up troublemakers. And we've also become aware, in line with this, not talking about the moles, and they're international moles, and they're paid. They're paid moles. They're in the West. They're under the employ of, for example, Russia, and they do Russia's bidding, and they sow propaganda in Western media outlets because Western media outlets generally are free, and they believe in freedom of expression. And Russia, of course, does not believe in freedom of expression, but they use, and once again, they think this is weakness. And all of these dictators, they think that this is all weakness. The Germans were the very same. The Japanese were the very same. They thought that they could defeat America, for example, because the West was weak. And they think that freedom of expression is one of the weaknesses of the West. And so they laugh inwardly. They think they're getting one over. And, admittedly, they do damage, but it's important to adhere to your principles. So, anyway, getting back to this, we become aware of the feud, you could call it, between the New York Times under A.G. Salzberger, and that's Salzberger. And he's an oligarch, to be sure, of the kind that we talk about. He's a hereditary oligarch. He's the family owner of much of the stock, not all of it, but much of the stock of the New York Times, which is supposed to be, America's newspaper. It's supposed to be, it styles itself as the newspaper of record. And he's now running the show, and he has been for a while. And we're told that he's angry. And he's not happy because President Biden won't give him the lengthy sit-down interview with people like Maggie Haberman and Eric and Michael Schmidt and a bunch of others. In other words, the New York Times stable of writers, like when I say stable, I mean like where you keep horses. Stable of writers that AG, and that's Salzberger, calling him AG for short, keeps for this. And instead, and this is really to a pretentious, arrogant, prideful oligarch like this just had to be a slap in the face. Because what Biden did was he dared, using a word that AG might have used, to go on Howard Stern. And, Howard Stern, he's a shock jock, and he's a funny guy. He really is. So this must have just made Salzberger's eyes pop out of his head, and it's made his head crack open and orange light shine out of it or something like that. It's just very funny. I mean, this would just blow his mind because Howard is what is known as a shock jock. And what he does is he takes people who, shall we say, do not express mainstream values, and he puts them on the air, and he talks to them, and he interviews them. And it's a very entertaining show. And he's been around for many years, and now he's kind of an old man, and he's still doing it. So Biden dared to go on Howard Stern, and this just freaked them out. And he's like, Salzberger's like, how dare you? And here's the animus. Here's the overarching zeitgeist of these media oligarchs. His attitude is this: you owe that. In other words, Biden owes it to the New York Times. I mean, and the presumption, the arrogance. Biden owes it to the New York Times. So that's one. So it's presumption. And the next thing is, it's just to have the power. Salzberger and company, they want to determine the election. And this is just really important that you understand. I'm getting ahead of myself. I was about to make a point that I'm going to make a little bit later, but they want to influence it. They want to shape the whole thing. The second one is that they want to try to advance Trump as much as they can. And in particular, they would like to see Trump win. And this is kind of one of the reasons for this, is to protect their own backside so that they don't run afoul of Trump if he should get elected. So in advance of him getting elected, for the sake of the argument, they are making nice with him so as not to particularly anger him, so that he would come down in the reprisals that he plans in Project 2025, which we talk about on this show, and we undoubtedly will talk about more, to muzzle the press and to repress the press. That sounded funny, no pun intended. Oppress the press. That's even worse. Oppress the press, repress the press, and, put journalists like me and like them in re-education camps. So this is the class reason that they want to see Trump win. And it is truly unfortunate to have to bring up stuff like this and speak in these terms. Here's what I was going to say. But this is what it is. You and I generally do not think of such things. We don't. And these ideas are foreign and inimical to us. But unfortunately, there are people for whom this is everything. They eat, they sleep, They live, they love, and they drink it. And it would be a huge mistake. And I know this is tough because I don't want to think about this, and I don't even want to acknowledge that this exists, but you need to. It would be a huge mistake to think that this is not the case, and to think, moreover, that we can lightly pass over it as listeners to Politics by Jake and ignore it and go about our business. This is a part of Politics by Jake, of course, to persuade you not to do this and to not just live your life, which I know you would all rather do, and to help you see what is really going on. So to speak, the class explanation, and this is bedrock, is this question that the oligarchy, of which Salzberger is a member, and the rest of the media that is controlled by billionaires, hates Biden. And why do they hate him? It's just so simple. If you need to not look beyond the mark. The mark is close. It's close to your understanding. It is understandable as anything understandable can be, and it's basically the pocketbook. They hate him for taxation. We've talked about the top rate corporate income tax rate of 28%, which is incredibly low. I mean, in the 50s under Eisenhower, who was a Republican, the top tax rate before, deductions and itemizations and everything like that was 90%. And I have never heard anybody say that we had a bad economy in the 1950s. So 28% is just incredibly low, and nobody should object to it. But these oligarchs, these billionaires, they don't want to pay anything. So we have that. We have the 25% alternative minimum income tax on billionaires, which is in addition to the 28% corporate income tax rate, the top rate. And also in December of 2025, all of the $2 trillion worth of tax cuts, essentially emoluments, although emoluments isn't necessarily exactly quite the word to use, but let's use it because it's just basically a gift from a government, an emolument, and the benefits that the billionaire class gets from the tax scam of 2017, which by far favors the wealthy. It does not favor you and me. These are due to sunset, these provisions, in December of 2025. And I've heard various, and I haven't looked it up, but it's okay just to say it this way. I've heard the 21st, I've heard the 25th, I've heard end of the year, or January 31st. It doesn't matter. If Biden is in the presidency, or if a Democrat of any kind is in the presidency in the end of the year, December 2025, those provisions, those benefits for the billionaires will sunset, and they will be no longer in effect. And so the billionaires and the oligarchs and Wall Street and the money power, what have you, they want these to continue, and they'll continue unabated, and they will continue forever. And they must not. These types must be reined in. And if Biden is in the White House, he has already said that he will let them expire. So once again, understanding this is crucial. It's all about the money. It's all about the money. This is bedrock. This is base level, and it's easy for anybody to understand who lives and works in this economy. They hate him for that. They hate him for promoting antitrust. They hate him for promoting unions, because the Federal Reserve does not want us workers to receive a decent wage. They don't like it. The Federal Reserve has, and this is a little bit of a simplification because we haven't talked that much about the Federal Reserve, except to say that it's a scam and that it's a dishonor to the nation and it's a fraud. But to talk about it more would take more time. I don't have that planned for this show. We'll talk about it. And we've talked about it in other shows as well. So the Federal Reserve has been described as somebody who goes to a party and brings the punch bowl. And then when the party, and the punch bowl is the idea of recovery. When you're in a depression or some similar thing, or a recession, the Fed has been described as someone who brings a punch bowl to the party and it's great and it's very tasty. And as soon as the party gets going, they take it away. And one of the things that they take away, because they do not want wages. And what do unions do? Unions promote high wages. They promote a balance because there's kind of a triad, or more than a triad, with regard to how the economy works. You have the government, which is basically the franchisor, and basically says, if you do this, we'll let you do business here. Then you have the corporations and the various people who run things. And then you have labor. And there must be a balance between all three. If you don't have a balance, everything gets out of whack. And there's a really excellent book, which I intend to talk about at some point, that talks about this balance. This is something that nobody thinks about. But economically speaking, and it's kind of economics 101, it's not deep economic theory, that you need this balance, and that if labor is out of whack, for example, this will cause problems within the economy. But the people who are controlling these things, and it must be said, economics is kind of a goofy science, because economics is really what economics is designed to do is it's designed to preserve the existing status quo. And so it tends to be kind of dishonest in a way, but it's not totally dishonest. It's dishonest with some things it does. But this is economics 101. And there has to be this balance. If there's not this balance, things begin to go wrong. And there haven't been federal increases in wages for a very long time. And there need to be. And even some of the states have realized that this needs to happen. Municipalities, county governments, some of them have voluntarily raised wages to $15 and $20 an hour, which is great, but the federal government needs to come along. And of course, the federal government, one of the cabinet posts is the Treasury. And guess who runs the Treasury? The president of the Federal Reserve. So you have a private organization. The Federal Reserve is not a governmental organization. It's a private organization. I guess I'm going to talk about this a little bit more than I thought I was going to. It's a private organization. It is controlled by, the proverbial international bankers, or the ones who control the banks, like in the very same way that the Bank of England is controlled by private interests, and in the very same way that the Bank of France, for example, is controlled by private interests. I mean, this is the fraud. This is the scandal. This is the scam that is our financial system. And these are the ones, and you literally have the member of a private organization, the head of a private organization, operating, sitting in the cabinet of the President of the United States. And it's been this way ever since approximately 1913, which is when the Federal Reserve Act was passed. So unions fight against this, and they're going to fight against this. And they hate Biden for promoting antitrust as well, because trust in these kinds of words is an operation that is in restraint of trade, and that is in restraint of competition. And oligarchs and billionaires want this. They don't want competition because they are not capitalists. If you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which you will hear libertarians and Republicans talk about, and which is said to be the bedrock of our capitalist system, one of the things that Smith says is that, and this was a book that was written back in the 1700s, and it's an interesting book. I mean, it's kind of tomish, it's kind of dry, but it would be worthwhile for you to read it, even though it's long. And one of the things that Smith says is that if you're a capitalist, you accept risk. And so antitrust is anti-capitalism because there is no risk. The whole idea of a trust situation where the billionaires, for example, basically own everything and there is no competition, just like someone said once, I love capitalism, but the only problem with it is that there's a tendency for the big fish to eat the little fish. There you're getting to a trust situation. And antitrust is to break that up and to prevent that from happening. And the billionaires don't want this. And so Biden wants competition because competition is the American way. And he doesn't want trust. He is antitrust, going all the way back to the time of Teddy Roosevelt. He was one of the things he was called was a trust buster because there were trusts in those days. There was the oil trust, there was the steel trust, there was the railroad trust. And, this is getting back to what I talk about in politics, which is one of the basic reasons for Politics by Jake, is because this is just a redo of history. If you go back to the time in history that's known as the Gilded Age, these trusts exist. There were the oil barons, there were the steel barons, so on and so forth. The Gilded Age is a time from, I don't know, about 1865, 1870 to about, call it 1910 or something like that, in which these people existed. And now we have it again. So history repeats itself. But if you don't know what the Gilded Age is, if you've never heard of it, if you've never read about it, and with the internet, super easy to do, to read about it, you will not recognize these things when they occur again. And this new Gilded Age is reoccurring again. And so, and there were people who were for the common people, like Teddy Roosevelt, and they wanted to do trust busting. And that's why he was called a trust buster. And trust busting is antitrust. And Biden is antitrust. And he wants to promote violating, this is another thing, he wants to promote violating the interests of the bondholders who want to keep collecting that interest, until the end of time. And this has partly to do with the tax scam of 2017, but also generally. For example, he's against the student debt because you have a very limited amount of organizations that are actually controlling the loans, and they're collecting that interest, and it's heinous. I mean, there has to become a time. The idea of bankruptcy, which is one of the only of American law, and I think it's the only part that's actually literally specifically mentioned in the United States Constitution, the bankruptcy court is mentioned. It's so that people can have a fresh start, because it's in the interest of people to have a fresh start. If you have people trying to get ahead, young people trying to get ahead in their naivete and going ahead and having these loans, which are oppressive and which they have to make continual interest payments on for 10, 20, 30 years, that is not in the interests of a balanced economy. To saddle these young people with this debt and to keep collecting it and collecting it and collecting it. So this is the idea of bankruptcy, among other things, to give people a fresh start. And the idea extends to going after bondholders and other people who collect interest until the end of time. There needs to be an end to it. And this includes all quantifiable money interests, that the bondholder class, the plutocrat class, has to keep fighting out, and that's what they do. And this other explanation is that it's a matter of gate receipts for the paper. Of course, naturally, money is money. And this is Politics by Jake. And one of the things that we have to do in this fight, talking about what you, the listening audience, can do to defeat fascism because really what you're doing, although it may seem like just you're doing it, you're changing the outlook of the world. You are changing it. You are in control of the government. The one thing that the oligarchs and the plutocrats and the money power hate more than anything is that on the baseline, you're the final defense of democracy. And that defense is what I call sacred, the sacred franchise of the vote. Other countries don't have that, or they basically pretend like they have it, like Russia with their sham elections that they have, which is just it's a bunch of Potemkin village nonsense to make it look to the world like they're conducting actual elections when in fact they're not. I mean, if you want to call it an election where there are armed guards standing by the ballots with AK-47 machine guns, I mean, if you want to say that's a free and fair election, I mean, have at it, Haas, and see, anything that gets you through the night. But they're not free and they're not fair. It's just a bunch of nonsense. And these oligarchs, and sometime I'll talk to you about this person called the old oligarch. Goes back to 400 BC, and how he actually argued against building a wall around Athens, which was necessary so that the Persians wouldn't invade. It's just crazy. It's just, we're not going to talk about it now. One of the many things here on Politics by Jake that we will talk about once I get a chance. But this is the thing where some of the things they do, and some of the things they do, they like defeat themselves. Somebody recently said, and it's a statement that I adhere to, is that democracy is not saved so much by the attempts of you, my listeners, and those of us in radio broadcasting, podcasting, journalism, who are fighting against fascism, but by the dumbness, the sheer dumbness and the stupidity of those who are seeking to destroy it. They're not smart. They're just not. So one of the things to do, and this was a standout recently, the previous week or two, there was, and this is with regard to what to do, what you, the listener, the individual listener can do. There was the Maryland Democratic primary. It was not the general election. It was for the Senate, but it was the primary between two Democrats. And you had this billionaire wine merchant. His name is Trone, Trone, and he spent $60 million. And then you have his challenger, and she won. And her name, get this, her name is Angela Also Brooks, ALSO, so like also. So like if I was going to talk to you and I was going to say, and also, that's part of her name, and BROOKS is the other part. So her name is Angela Also Brooks, and that's actually a name. That's quite a name, isn't there? And she spent about 1/9 of that. And at the eve of the election, it was supposed to be a tie. And it turned out, and again, this is the classic rejoinder to all the nonsensical polling that is going on that just absolutely positively skews what is going on. Trump doesn't have a lead. He's behind, and he's always been behind because of the type of polling that was using. But the right is trying to persuade you that he is so far ahead that you shouldn't even try to oppose him because he's going to be elected. Just get on his good side because he's going to be elected, and that's what's going to happen. But someone said once, and it's just absolutely true, that the best poll is on election night. And when you got to the eve of the election, or rather on election night, it turned out to be a lead of 10% for Also Brooks. Well, I mean, this is significant. How do you handle this? I mean, I know how I handle it, but I'm afraid some of the Democrats, have lost their way. I would say, for example, that Carville is showing signs of disorientation, and I would recommend the alternative because this is 10%. That's huge. That's an incredibly skewed result. And they were trying to tell you that it was a tie, and the media was trying to tell you that it was a tie, and it was 10% off. I mean, when you go into statistics, quantitative analysis of things, there's a phrase called statistical significance. And statistical significance is comparatively minor, and it deals with deviations in tenths of a percent. And if you get a deviation that is, like I say, a few tenths of a percent, that becomes and is called, by those who are in the know and understand quantitative analysis, that is called statistical significance. 10%, that's statistical significance that you can drive the Starship Enterprise through. I mean, that's gigantic. And this just goes to show, once again, what we talk about polling. It's nonsense. Don't believe this stuff. It's a bunch of nonsense. And fortunately now, especially since Trump is now a convicted felon, people are a little less afraid. Joe Scarborough was talking about this, that these pollings are nonsense. I think I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the show. But getting back to the analysts on this kind of stuff, there's an analyst named Rachel Bidikofer, and she says, and I like this attitude because this really, in my opinion, this is what it is. she says that what you've got to do is you've got to tell the electorate, and I just totally agree with this. We are not in business as usual. What you've got to do, if the possible outcome of the election is more or less the end of the world as we've known it, you've got to tell the voters that. And that's what we here do, and I agree with that. And at PB&J, we do that. If we don't win in this election, if the MAGA fascists and the cultists who worship Donald Trump as a god, if they win, it's basically the end of the world that as we've known it. And as an individual listener, I highly recommend, and Bidikofer says, you've got to tell the voters that. You've got to show them what that means. It's the end of Medicare. It's the end of Social Security. It's the end of many things. It's the roundup of minorities. One of the things that cracks me up is that these members of the squad, they get up and they talk about how they hate Biden and how Biden can't count on their votes. And they're Muslims, the Muslim community. And who do you think Trump, if he gets into the presidency again, if he attains to the presidency once more, part of Project 2025 is roundups. Who do you think the people are that he's going to round up first? He's going to round up the Muslims. Has Biden ever rounded up the Muslims and sent them to re-education camps, concentration camps, deported them? Has he ever done that? Of course he hasn't done that. That's a bunch of nonsense. This is ultra-left fratricide caucus nonsense. And it doesn't make any sense, but that's what they're doing. And, they're elected members of the House. In most cases, it's the House. And they're saying these things. But this is not business as usual. And if you are a Muslim in her constituency, you need to understand that if you vote against Biden and Trump gets in, your head is on the chopping block. And it's just absolutely, literally this way. And how do I know that? How can I say that? Because Project 2025 talks about that. So, all right. So, again, that's what we hear at Politics by Jake saying. And if somebody is using the rhetoric, for example, of Hitler, like they're talking about blood and soil and stuff like that, and they're talking about that, and this goes to the Muslims again, but not merely the Muslims, but also the Muslims. They're talking about blood and soil, talking about, and this is part of what Hitler said. He said that these people were vermin, and he talked about how they were polluting the blood of the nation. This is fascist propaganda. This is fascist rhetoric. This is exactly what Hitler said. This is what the Nazis said. These are the simple messages about which Hitler is said to have said to Goebbels, lies, lies, tell them lies. The bigger, the better. Sooner or later, something is bound to stick. And simple ideas are the best. Blood and soil is one of them. Polluting the purity of the race, that's one of them. If you think they're not talking about the Muslims when Trump says that, think again. That is fascist rhetoric. It's Nazi propaganda. And that's what we have. So, in other words, you, my listeners, when you're out there, you've got to make sure that the voters hear that. And if you have minority groups, if we have black voters and we have Hispanic voters somehow forgetting who they're dealing with, and you unfortunately, you have that kind of a situation, then you have to remind them of that. In other words, so there's room for a lot of honest propaganda. Naturally, the Republicans will say that's very negative. That's playing, you're going negative on us here. For example, Trump is now the Republicans are getting mad because Biden has started calling Trump a convicted felon, and they're getting mad at him because you're saying, oh, that's a low blow. Hey, you know what? In 2016, they called Hillary Clinton crooked Hillary, and there was no evidence. It was the typical snow job that the right-wing fascist and reactionary media do in supporting Trump, getting him into office and saying these things, and there really was never any evidence. And, at Politics by Jake, I don't hold particularly any brief for Hillary Clinton, which is a way of saying I don't necessarily favor her. But the point is that when you're talking about rhetoric, when you're talking about propaganda, they said this about her, and it was insubstantial and without a cause. And now, when you have a situation where Trump has actually been convicted, 34 counts, 34 indictments, 34 counts. He's a felon. He's a convicted felon. They just get mad about that, and they say, "Oh, it's a low blow. You're going negative on us here," they say. And no, it's just telling it like it is. And if the guy comes out and talks about all of these things, talk about the right to, not in his terms, similar stuff, you've got to realize if you say the opposition is vermin, like, for example, and that you want to make sure the body politic here is not poisoned. Look, the blood of the country is not poisoned because there are Muslims, because there are Latinos, because there are African Americans. This is because there are Jewish people here, of which there are so many. The blood of the country is not poisoned, okay? This is ridiculous. This is all fascist rhetoric. That's all it is. And somehow we just had this wonderful moment where we had a weekend where the New York Times was again filled with articles where Biden is too old, because that's one of the things they're saying. Biden is too old. He can't be the president. But I'll tell you, is that the question? They want you to think that's the question, but is that really the question? I mean, if the election is a referendum on whether Biden is too old, and then if you don't elect Biden, dictatorship looms, listen, that's the question. That's what you got to point out. And if you don't point that out, you're dissembling, or you're allowing yourself to be swayed. You've got to tell the people what it is and not think about how they're going to automatically come to the right conclusion. You can't assume that, because the fascist, plutocratic, oligarchic, money power media is very powerful, and they're hitting you 24/7, 365 with all of this stuff. And it would be easy, and they're paid to do it. And it would be easy to become swayed. Even my listeners, it would be easy to become swayed. So you must not think that they're automatically going to come to the correct conclusion about this. So the question here now is, and always is on Politics by Jake, the struggle against fascism, the struggle against Trump, the struggle against MAGA and the cult of worship around Donald Trump that it is, and the struggle against fascist dictatorship, and generally the struggle about fascism in the world. And this is Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake, and we have been talking about for the past few minutes with regard to why the right hates Biden. And it's not just a domestic thing. You have the international community, some who don't like him, the dictators, basically. I mean, you have Xi in China. Xi is very dismayed. He's got a bad economy, and he's responsible for it, and that's creating big problems. And he is marshaling the military, threatening Taiwan, which is more or less common, but he's stepping it up, and he's comparatively impotent. According to Jane's military periodical, he's going to have to wait another 5 years before he can attack Taiwan. So he's just posturing, and he's violating Taiwan airspace. He's violating Taiwan territorial waters. He's basically surrounding Taiwan with his military. He's encroaching on the South China Sea, which, actually, the South China Sea really, more correctly, should be called the Philippine Sea, because that's basically what it is. He's creating all kinds of navigational hazard. He's having his ships ordered to run into other ships in the area. He's taking over atolls and other small islands, some of which he's building up, and he's claiming them for China. And this is all against it's a violation. This is a violation of the international rules. And once again, he's one of these people who he feels like it's too bad that he has to obey the rules, and that he gets sanctioned and slapped down by the West and by the United States, certainly, whenever he does so. whenever he decides that he's going to do something more. And so he hates Biden, and he wants Trump in the presidency. And I'm going somewhere with this. Putin is similar. I mean, we all obviously see the situation with that. I mean, Putin had Ukraine in a situation where Trump, when he was in the presidency, was actually demanding bribes from Ukraine, which Ukraine would not do. And Putin thought he had the situation in hand and that Ukraine was going to be his next conquest. But Biden was in the presidency, and he found out that that was not true, and he's suffering crippling sanctions. Biden has gotten together the international community, and he has taken over this situation. And Russia is a pariah. They're a terrorist state. Putin is a war criminal. He can't go to many places because he'll be arrested. And so he hates Biden too, and he wants Biden defeated. So let's talk about Israel. What about Netanyahu? Netanyahu has been indicted by a couple of courts with regard to war crimes. And we have to say that, Hamas is at fault here too. Haniyeh has been indicted and is subject to arrest. Sinawar, who is on the ground in Gaza, he has too. And we have, so what's Netanyahu going to do about this? And we have a very interesting observer, Alan Pincus, who says that there's only one purpose, and he says that Biden has to be made weaker. The goal of Bibi is to weaken and defeat Biden, okay? He hated Obama. He hates Biden. Bibi is not friends with Biden. The guy is a dissembler. He's been described as a kind of a low human being. So Pincus is right, and that's what I would say too. It's clear that the nefarious and devious Bibi is coming to the United States principally for the purpose of weakening Biden. However, let's leave open the outside possibility that if Bibi gets here and sees that Biden is really winning the upper hand in the way I think he is, maybe Bibi would basically, say, okay, I've got to make a deal with him, and I'll stay in power in order to do that. And remember, he'd like to, for example, he'd like to have the war with Iran. But the main thing, in order to do anything, he's got to stay in as prime minister because he's in the same situation as Trump. If he loses being prime minister, that's a big step on the way to jail for him. So he's responding, and I think he's responding, and you can see this, you can gather the inferences on this. He's responding because this weakens Trump. He sees that Trump is weak. And so these are the ways that you get rid of the gaslighting and you see through the reality, and that's part of what we're talking about. And that's basically all the time we have for this show. The next edition of the show is going to be Monday morning, June 10th. And until then, we hope you have a pleasant weekend, and you'll come back here at 7 a.m. to listen to more Politics by Jake. Bye now.